Thompson stared at his tactical display, coffee growing cold in his grip, as the impalpable data refreshed every 30 seconds. Grid reference 314.1287 showed the same signature it had for the past 14 hours. Single aircraft maintaining Perk staging at 8,000 feet above the dispute valley. His radar operator, Staff Sergeant Mills, had recalibrated the equipment twice, convinced the system was malfunctioning. That contact hasn't moved more than 50 meters in any direction since 400 hours, Mills reported, his voice carrying the weight of disbelief. Initial classification shows it's an A-10 Thunderbolt, but that's impossible. Nothing stays up that long without refueling. Leaned forward, studying the green blip that defied everything he understood about aviation fuel capacity and pilot endurance. The A-10 Warthog was legendary for its load time, designed to circle battlefields like a mechanical vulture, but even the most optimized mission profile couldn't explain that anomaly. In hours meant someone up there had either discovered a new form of perpetual motion, or was operating under parameters that challenged the laws of physics and human physiology. And post-atmosphere grew tenser with each passing hour. Phone calls to higher headquarters yielded no information about scheduled operations in the area. The aircraft wasn't responding to radio hails on any frequency, military or civilian. It simply hung there, a metallic question mark painted against the morning sky, its twin turbofan engines somehow staying flight in defiance of every fuel calculation Thompson had ever learned at the War College. Martinez arrived at 1800 hours, his pressed uniform contrasting sharply with the rumble fatigues of the staff who'd been monitoring the situation since dawn. He studied the display with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen combat in 3 different theaters, his weathered hands tracing the aircraft's minimal movement pattern. "Is it engaged in targets?" Martinez asked, his voice carrying the authority of command. "Negative, sir," Thompson replied. "No weapons released, no targeting missions, no communication attempts. It's just there." His eyes narrowed as he considered possibilities that ranged from mechanical failure to psychological breakdown to something far more complex. In his 26 years of service, he witnessed extraordinary acts of courage, devastating mistakes, and the occasional miracle that defied rational explanation. But there was something entirely different. At the command post, the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson. Somewhere above the valley, an A-10 continued its vigil, its pilot unknown, its mission unclear, its presence a pull that would soon transform from curiosity to legend, challenging everything the military thought it knew about the limits of human determination and the true meaning of holding the line. It crowded with routine track from other units, but grid 314.1287 remained silent, its guardian angel speaking a language that transcended words, written in the simple act of refusing to abandon her post. The mystery was about to be impersonal, and Mayor Thompson was about to learn that some stories begin not with answers, but with the courage to ask questions that might change everything. Lena Reaper, Vasquez had been airborne for 15 hours and 37 minutes when her fuel gauge finally touched the red line that should have forced her back to base 6 hours earlier. The A-10's twin General Electric TF-34 turbofans continued their steady whisper, a mechanical heartbeat that matched her own as she maintained her orbit above the valley where Bravo Company had gone silent 48 hours ago. And stayed despite the exhaustion that pressed against her consciousness like a physical weight, made minute adjustments to the flight controls. The Warthog responded with the mechanical precision she'd learned to trust during 3 combat deployments, its titanium bathtub protecting her from ground fire, while she'd become intimately familiar with every rivet and panel of the cockpit that had become both sanctuary and prison. Oh, the valley stretched like a wound carved into the earth, its shadows hiding secrets that had cost 7 soldiers their lives before Reaper had arrived to establish overwatch. The thermal imaging display painted a monochrome landscape, where heat signatures bloomed and faded like electronic codes, each one potentially friendly or hostile, each one demanding the kind of split-second decision that separated heroes from casualties in the unforgiving arithmetic of combat. Radio headset carried the distant chatter of units operating in safer airspace. Their routine communications, a reminder of the normal world she'd left behind when she made the decision to extend her mission beyond any reasonable parameter. Operations had stopped calling her after hour 10. Their increasingly urgent demands for her return eventually replaced by silence that spoke of conferences in air-conditioned rooms where men in clean uniforms debated the career implications of an insubordinate pilot. The situation was becoming critical in ways that transcended mere numbers on a gauge. Physics demanded tribute, and even the most efficient turbofan engine couldn't extract energy from empty tanks. But Reaper had discovered something during her extended vigil that no flight manual had ever taught her, that some missions existed in the space between possible and necessary, where determination could temporarily suspend the laws that governed left commit. A sign had been earned during her first deployment, when she successfully prosecuted 17 targets in a single mission, each one a threat eliminated with the cold precision that had made them legendary. But today, success wasn't measured in targets destroyed. Today, it was measured in the simple act of being present when presence itself became a weapon, when the sound of her engine served as both promise and warning to anyone who might threaten the Americans somewhere in the valley below. Under red 8,000 feet, altitude that provided optimal coverage while remaining outside the effective range of most small arms fire. She'd memorized every contour of the terrain beneath her wings, every potential hide site and avenue of approach, her eyes constantly scanning for the movement that would transform her from guardian to executioner. Warthog carried enough ordnance to level a small city, but its most powerful weapon was patience, and Reaper had learned to wield that weapon with a precision that bordered on artistry. Squadron Commander Lieutenant Colonel Hayes had specifically ordered her to return to base after a standard 4-hour combat air patrol. That had been 11 hours ago. Colonel Hayes stared at the secure phone in his hand, wondering how to explain to Two-Star General, while one of his pilots had apparently decided that direct orders were mere suggestions. The conversation with Division had been brief and pointed, leaving him with the kind of career-threatening problem that no amount of leadership training had prepared him to handle. "We've got confirmation from ground radar," Major Petrov reported from across the operations center. "Hammer 21 is still on station, but she's got to be running on fumes by now. Even with maximum fuel conservation, she should have been walking home 3 hours ago." Nodded grimly, understanding the physics involved. The A-10's internal fuel capacity, even when supplemented by external tanks, couldn't sustain the kind of extended operations that Vasquez was apparently conducting. She was either experiencing some kind of catastrophic radio failure that prevented her from acknowledging orders, or she was deliberately ignoring every regulation in the book. Explanation offered much comfort. A radio failure would explain the lack of communication, but not her continued presence over the target area. A deliberate violation of orders suggested something far more serious, a pilot who'd crossed the line from aggressive to reckless, transformation that could end careers and lives with equal affinity. Squadron's intelligence officer, Captain Morris, approached with a folder containing satellite imagery and signal intercepts that painted a complicated picture of the tactical situation. The valley where Vasquez maintained her vigil had become a focal point for insurgent activity, with multiple indicators suggesting a major operation in planning or execution phase. We're seeing increased radio chatter in the area, Morris explained, spreading photographs across his desk. The insurgents are definitely aware of Hammer 21's presence, but they seem reluctant to move during daylight hours. It's possible that her extended patrol is disrupting something significant. He studied the imagery, looking for clues that might explain why his pilot had chosen to extend her mission beyond any reasonable limit. The photographs showed typical Afghan terrain, rocky, austere, unforgiving, but the intelligent pattern suggested something more complex than a routine patrol area. His phone rang again, the red handset that connected him directly to higher headquarters. Division wanted answers, and Hayes was running out of plausible explanations that didn't involve throwing one of his best pilots under the administrative bus that would end her career and possibly result in court-martial proceedings. He answered, bracing for another uncomfortable conversation. This is General Morrison. I need to understand what's happening with your aircraft over grid 314. We've got congressional staffers asking questions about extended operations, and I need answers that won't end up on the evening news. He closed his eyes, understanding that the situation had escalated beyond squadron-level damage control. When generals started mentioning congressional oversight, careers began ending with the mechanical efficiency of a well-oiled bureaucracy. The Valley Reaper continued her orbit, unaware that her extended mission had become a political problem that threatened to eclipse the tactical situation she was trying to resolve. Her fuel gauge now registered levels that should have triggered automatic emergency procedures, but the Warthog continued flying, sustained by something that transcended both fuel and regulation, the simple refusal to abandon responsibility when abandonment might cost lives. UN Reaper's cockpit had been silent for 6 hours, not because of equipment failure, but because she deliberately switched to a discrete frequency that headquarters wouldn't monitor. The decision violated communication protocols and chain of command procedures, but it also freed her from the increasingly urgent recall orders that would have forced her to abandon her mission just as the tactical situation was developing into something that demanded her presence. Eyes moved constantly between the instruments that told the story of an aircraft operating at the absolute limits of its design parameters and the ground below, where thermal signatures suggested movement patterns that warranted closer investigation. Function displays painted an electronic portrait of threats and opportunities, each symbol representing calculations that could determine whether American soldiers would return home or become statistics in a conflict that seemed to resist resolution through conventional means. The situation had progressed beyond critical in territory that most pilots would consider suicidal. Her engines were consuming vapors and determination in roughly equal measure, but the Warthog continued to fly with the stubborn reliability that had made it legendary among ground forces, who understood that survival often depended on close air support arriving exactly when needed, regardless of fuel calculations and administrative convenience. We should identify what appeared to be a staging area for the kind of complex ambush that had already caused Bravo Company 7 soldiers. The thermal signatures were subtle, almost ghostly, but they followed patterns that spoke of military training and coordination. Insurgents were positioning themselves for an operation that would likely target the next American unit to enter the valley, and Reeves' presence was the only thing preventing them from executing their plan. Hands made small corrections to maintain optimal position, the flight controls responding with the mechanical precision she learned to trust during countless hours of training in combat. The A-10 was designed for exactly this kind of mission, extended loitering over hostile territory while providing protection for ground forces, but even the most robust aircraft had limits that couldn't be ignored indefinitely. Irony wasn't lost on her that she spent years fighting for respect in a community that often viewed female combat pilots with skepticism. Her call sign had been earned through performance that exceeded most of her male counterparts, but she still faced the subtle discrimination that suggested women couldn't handle the physical and psychological demands of close air support missions. She was demonstrating capabilities that transcended gender, rank, and regulation. The simple ability to remain on station when remaining on station was the only thing standing between American soldiers and disaster. Squadron standard operating procedures called for 4-hour missions followed by 12-hour crew rest periods. She'd now been airborne for 16 hours, operating in a realm where standard procedure became meaningless, and success was measured by the willingness to put beyond every limit that training and experience suggested was absolute. Warthog's engines continued their steady whisper, burning fuel that no longer registered on instruments calibrated for normal operation, sustained by the kind of determination that transformed routine missions into legends. Where below, American soldiers were depending on her presence, whether they knew it or not. That knowledge had become more powerful than fuel, more compelling than orders, more important than the career implications that would inevitably follow her decision to place mission accomplishment above personal survival. Sergeant Marks Williams pressed himself deeper into the rocky outcrying that provided minimal cover from the observation he knew was somewhere above. His unit, the remnants of Bravo Company, had been moving through the valley for 6 hours, following intelligence that suggested a high-value target was operating from one of the cave complexes that honeycombed the mountainside. The sound had been constant, a distant whisper of turbofan engines that spoke of American air power maintaining overwatch. Williams had served 2 previous deployments and understood the psychological impact of close air support. The knowledge that an A-10 was circling overhead changed the tactical equation in ways that extended far beyond the aircraft's actual weapons capabilities. That bird's been up there since we started the movement, Private Rodriguez whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind that carved through the valley like a knife. How long can those things stay airborne? He considered the question, drawing on experience that had taught him to appreciate the capabilities and limitations of the aircraft that provide fire support for ground operations. A-10s were legendary for their loiter time, but even the most optimized mission profile had boundaries defined by fuel capacity and pilot endurance. The aircraft above them had been maintained stationed for longer than any reasonable tactical scenario would require. More than you'd think, Williams replied, but privately he was beginning to wonder if they were witnessing something extraordinary. The sound of the engines never varied, never suggested the power adjustments that would indicate normal patrol patterns. It was as if the aircraft had taken root in the sky, becoming a permanent fixture rather than a temporary guardian. Radio crowded with routine communications from other elements operating in the area, but no specific reference to their air support. That struck him as unusual. Close air support was typically coordinated through a complex web of communication that kept ground forces informed about aircraft availability and mission parameters. The silence suggested something outside normal procedures was happening above their heads. The mission had been compromised from the beginning. Intelligence suggested that insurgent forces had detected their insertion and were positioning for an ambush that would likely cost lives unless the Americans could reach defensive positions before being engaged. The presence of close air support changed those calculations, but only if the aircraft remained on station long enough to respond to contact. With binoculars, Williams studied the terrain ahead, looking for signs of the ambush he knew was being prepared. The valley offered numerous opportunities for concealment, and insurgent forces had demonstrated tactical sophistication that demanded respect. They would wait for the optimal moment, when American forces were most vulnerable, before initiating contact that could decisively shift the tactical balance. The sound of the A-10's engine provided reassurance that transcended rational analysis. Williams had seen what the Warthog's 30 hand could do to fortified position, had witnessed the devastating effectiveness of its precision-guided munition, had experienced the psychological impact of having that firepower available when contact seemed imminent. More than the weapons, it was the simple knowledge that someone was watching, someone was ready to respond, someone understood that the success of the ground mission depended on maintaining their presence regardless of normal limitation. Them, Captain Vasquez continued her orbit, her fuel gauge now registering readings that should have triggered emergency procedures hours earlier. But the Warthog continued flying, sustained by determination that had transformed a routine mission into something approaching legend. Sergeant Commander known as Omar studied the American aircraft through Soviet air binoculars, calculating angles and timing with the precision that had kept him alive through 15 years of conflict. The A-10 had been circling for almost 17 hours, an impossible duration that suggested either mechanical failure or extraordinary commitment from its pilot. Fires were positioned throughout the valley, hidden among rocks and caves that provided excellent concealment from aerial observation. They'd been ready to execute their ambush for 6 hours, but the continued presence of American air power had forced them to remain concealed, unable to move into final positions without exposing themselves to attack from above. Pilot must be an American woman, his lieutenant whispered in Ashto, using the kind of casual misogyny that Omar had learned to ignore in favor of tactical practicality. Only one would be too stubborn to leave when ordered. Considered the observation, wondering if gender might actually explain the anomaly of them. American military forces include female pilots, practice that local fighters found both fascinating and tactically irrelevant. Whoever was flying that aircraft possessed skills and determination that transcended any demographic classification, creating a tactical problem that demanded respect regardless of the pilot's identity. Craft's flight pattern never varied, perfect orbit that provided optimal coverage of the valley, while remaining outside the effective range of the shoulder-fired missiles his unit possessed. The pilot understood the tactical situation with a precision that suggested extensive combat experience, maintaining altitude and distance that maximized defensive capabilities while minimizing vulnerability to ground fire. Radio operator reported increasing American ground activity in the valley, suggesting that the air support was coordinating with a larger operation that would complicate his unit's planned ambush. The original intelligence had indicated a small patrol that could be easily overwhelmed, but the extended presence of close air support suggested something more significant was developing. It was becoming his enemy. Extended concealment was exhausting his fighters, who'd been in position since dawn without food or water. The longer they wait, the more likely they were to be detected by the Americans who were undoubtedly using the air coverage to conduct detailed reconnaissance of potential ambush sites. Even while that aircraft remained overhead would be suicide. The A-10 sensors could detect movement patterns, and its weapons could respond faster than his fighters could reach cover. They were trapped in a tactical stalemate created by one pilot's refusal to follow normal operational procedures. Omar had fought American forces for over a decade, learning to respect their technology while exploiting their predictable adherence to procedures and time limitations. American operations followed patterns. They arrived, conducted their mission, and departed according to schedules that could be anticipated and exploited. This situation was different. This was personal. With binoculars, he could occasionally catch a glimpse of the aircraft as it completed its orbit, a dark silhouette against the afternoon sky that had become a symbol of American persistence rather than merely another weapons platform. The pilot up there was riding a different kind of warfare, one where determination could temporarily suspend the laws that govern conventional tactical thinking. Fighters were growing restless, their whispered communications revealing frustration with a plan that depended on American predictability. But Omar understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a demonstration of individual will that transformed a routine air support mission into a personal duel between opposing philosophies of warfare. Lena Vasquez felt the first subtle change in engine performance at hour 18. A slight roughness in the turbofan whisper that suggested fuel starvation was beginning to affect combustion efficiency. Her training had prepared her for the moment, but theoretical knowledge felt inadequate when confronted with the reality of flying an aircraft beyond its design limitations while maintaining responsibility for ground forces who remained in danger. Hog's fuel system was drawing from reserves that shouldn't exist, extracting energy from vapor and determination in proportions that defied engineering calculation. Her instruments showed readings that were either malfunctioning or documenting something that would require revision of technical manuals and operational procedures. Either explanation seemed preferable to the alternative, that she was operating in a realm where normal limitation no longer applied. Her body was beginning to show signs of the extended mission. Dehydration was affecting her concentration, and fatigue was creeping into muscle groups that had been maintaining precise control inputs for nearly a full day. Aviation medicine recognized strict duty time limitations based on research that demonstrated declining performance after a specific interval, but those limitations assumed normal operational stresses rather than the kind of existential commitment she was experiencing. Thermal imaging continued to reveal movement patterns that suggested hostile forces were positioned for operation against American ground units. The intelligence picture was becoming clearer with each orbit, painting a tactical scenario that would likely result in casualties if she abandoned her position. That knowledge had become more powerful than fuel gauges or flight regulation, transforming her mission from routine air support into something approaching security. Radio remained silent by choice rather than malfunction. She understood that headquarters was undoubtedly attempting to recall her, that her extended mission was probably generating administrative consequences that would follow her for the remainder of her career. But careers seemed less important than the lives of soldiers who were depending on her presence, whether they realized it or not. A-10's design philosophy emphasized survivability and mission completion of technological sophistication, creating an aircraft that could absorb tremendous damage while continuing to provide close air support. Today, that philosophy was being tested in ways that the original designers had never anticipated, not by any fire, but by one pilot's refusal to accept limitations that might cost American lives. Hands moved across the cockpit controls with the muscle memory developed through thousands of hours of training in combat, making adjustments that kept the aircraft stable despite operating conditions should have resulted in flameout or forced landing hours earlier. The Warthog responded with mechanical loyalty, its systems continuing to function in defiance of every parameter that defined normal operation. Fuel quantity indicator no longer provide meaningful information. Its digital display showing readings that suggested either complete system failure or consumption of reserves that weren't supposed to exist. But the engine continued running, their steady whisper providing both propulsion and reassurance. Some laws of physics were more flexible than others when confronted with sufficient determination. Had ceased to have normal meaning. Our mission had transcended the boundaries of schedules and due rosters, becoming something that existed in the space between possible and necessary, where individual will could temporarily overcome technological limitations and bureaucratic pursuit. Colonel Hayes stood before General Moran's desk, his dress uniform feeling uncomfortably formal for a conversation that would likely turn the trajectory of multiple careers. The Two-Star General's office was decorated with the kind of memorabilia that spoke of a distinguished military career, combat awards, unit photographs, and ceremonial weapons that represented decades of service in increasingly complex conflicts. I need to understand what's happening with your pilot, Morrison began, his tone suggesting that political considerations were beginning to override tactical ones. I've had senators asking questions about extended operations and fuel consumption, and I need answers that won't require congressional testimony. He had spent the previous 6 hours attempting to develop those answers, but the situation defied conventional explanation. Captain Vasquez had been airborne for 19 hours, operating in a realm that transcended normal flight operations while apparently conducting some form of close air support mission that hadn't been authorized by higher headquarters. Our assessment is that Hammer 21 is providing overwatch for ground operation in grid 314, Hayes replied, choosing his words carefully. The tactical situation appears to warrant extended presence, though we acknowledge that fuel considerations should have forced her return to base hours ago. Studied the intelligence report spread across his desk, documents that painted a complex picture of insurgent activity and American ground operations in an area that had already cost 7 soldiers their lives. The political dimensions were becoming as complicated as the tactical ones, with congressional oversight committees beginning to ask questions about operational efficiency and resource utilization. What you're telling me is that one of your pilots has decided that direct orders are optional, and that fuel capacity is merely suggestion, Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of command authority that had been refined through multiple combat deployments. That's either extraordinary courage or career-ending insubordination, and I need to understand which one I'm dealing with. Distinction was crucial in ways that extended beyond individual careers. Military discipline depended on adherence to orders and procedure, but combat effectiveness sometimes required initiative that put beyond conventional boundaries. The challenge was determining when extraordinary circumstances justified extraordinary action, and who possessed the authority to make those determinations. Understood that his response would influence not only Captain Vasquez's future, but potentially the careers of everyone in his chain of command. Military leadership required accepting responsibility for subordinates' actions, even when those actions occurred outside normal supervision and control. Captain Vasquez is one of our most experienced combat pilots, Hayes replied. Her tactical judgment has been proven in multiple deployments, and her commitment to mission accomplishment is exemplary. If she's maintaining station beyond normal parameters, there's likely a tactical reason that justifies the extended operation. So nod slowly, recognizing the careful language that suggests support for subordinate while acknowledging the complexity of the situation. Military leadership often required balancing competing priorities, mission accomplishment, true welfare, and institutional discipline, in ways that satisfied none completely but served all adequately. At the General's office, the administrative machinery of military bureaucracy was generating documentation that would either support or condemn the pilot who continued her orbit above a valley, where American soldiers remained in penal danger. The outcome would depend on factors that transcended individual performance, political considerations, public relations implications, and institutional presence that would influence future operations. Grid 314, Captain Vasquez continued her reveal, unaware that her extended mission had become the subject of general officer conferences and congressional interest. Sergeant Williams raised his hand, bringing his squad to a halt at the edge of a clearing that offered excellent fields of fire, but also exposed them to observation from the ridges above. His tactical instincts suggested that insurgent forces were positioned somewhere in the surrounding terrain, waiting for the Americans to move into a killing zone that would maximize casualties while minimizing their own exposure to return fire. Out of the A-10's engines had become a constant command, a mechanical heartbeat that provided psychological reassurance even as Williams began to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The aircraft had been overhead for nearly 20 hours, an impossible duration that suggested either mechanical failure or a pilot who had decided that normal operational limitations were less important than protecting ground forces. We've got movement on the ridgeline, Private Rodriguez whispered, pointing toward thermal signatures that were barely visible through the afternoon haze. Looks like they're positioning for enfilade fire if we cross the clearing. Studied the tactical situation, understanding that his squad was trapped between the need to continue their mission and the reality that moving forward would likely trigger the ambush that insurgent forces had spent hours preparing. The presence of air support changed the equation, but only if that support could respond effectively when contact was initiated. Radio crowd with a transmission from headquarters, ordering his unit to continue movement toward their objective despite the tactical complications that were becoming increasingly apparent. Higher command was apparently unaware of the developing situation, or they were prioritizing mission accomplishment over force protection in ways that ground troops understood but didn't always appreciate. 21, this is Bravo 6, Williams transmitted, attempting to establish communication with the aircraft that had been providing overwatch. We've got possible hostile positions on the ridgeline and need confirmation of your availability for immediate close air support if we get contact. Radio remained silent, not because the pilot couldn't hear the transmission, but because Captain Vasquez had switched to a frequency that allowed her to monitor ground operations without revealing her compromised communication status to higher headquarters. She could hear Williams' transmission, understood the tactical implications, and was prepared to respond with devastating effectiveness if American forces were engaged. She waited 30 seconds before transmitting again, using brevity codes that would convey maximum information with minimum radio exposure. Ground operations in hostile territory required careful balance between coordination and communication security, with too much radio track potentially revealing positions, while too little could result in friendly fire incidents or missed opportunities for support. The situation was reaching a decision point where movement in any direction would likely trigger contact with insurgent forces who had been waiting patiently for the Americans to enter their carefully prepared killing zone. The squad's survival would depend on the aircraft overhead, and Williams was beginning to understand that the pilot up there made the same calculation hours earlier when she decided to extend her mission beyond any reasonable limitation. Reaper maintained her orbit, her instruments showing fuel readings that defied rational explanation, while her eyes continued to scan for turrets that would require immediate engagement. She understood that the ground forces below were depending on her presence, and that knowledge had become more powerful than regulations or fuel calculation. The moment of decision was approaching, when tactical theory would meet combat reality, and the kind of engagement that would determine whether American soldiers returned home or became casualties in a conflict that seemed to resist resolution through conventional means. Lena Vasquez felt the second engine begin to roughen at hour 21. Its turbofan blades consumed fuel that existed more in determination than in tanks. She maintained her orbit above ground forces who remained in immediate danger. Training had prepared her for engine failure procedures, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for operating an aircraft that should have been on the ground 6 hours earlier, while continuing to provide life-or-death support for American soldiers. A-10's twin-engine design provided redundancy that was crucial for close air support missions, but even the most robust engineering couldn't indefinitely overcome the laws of physics that govern fuel consumption and engine operation. Her instruments were providing readings that would require investigation by maintenance specialists and possibly revision of technical publications that defined the aircraft's operational limitation. She could see the tactical situation developing into the kind of engagement that would likely result in American casualties, unless close air support could respond with precision and devastating effectiveness. Thermal imaging revealed insurgent positions that had been carefully prepared to maximize damage while providing concealment from ground observation, creating the kind of complex ambush that had already cost Bravo Company 7 soldiers. Hands continued to make the small control inputs that maintained optimal position for weapons employment. Muscle memory, overriding fatigue and dehydration, should have degraded her performance hours earlier. The Wardhog's flight controls responded with mechanical precision, its systems functioning in defiance of every parameter that defined normal operation. The situation had progressed beyond critical in territory that most pilots would consider suicidal, but Reaper had discovered that some missions existed in a realm where normal limitations became meaningless when measured against the cost of abandoning responsibility. Her engines were burning something that transcended jet fuel. They were consuming pure determination, converting will into thrust with an efficiency that couldn't be measured by conventional instruments. Communications from ground forces were becoming more urgent, their transmissions revealing tactical situations that required immediate air support to prevent casualties that would transform a difficult mission into a catastrophic loss. She understood that her continued presence was the only thing preventing insurgent forces from executing attacks that would likely overwhelm the Americans who were operating with minimal backup in terrain that favored defensive operations. Squadron standard operating procedures had become irrelevant hours earlier, replaced by the kind of personal commitment that transformed routine missions into legend. Every regulation she was violating had been written by people who understood aviation, but had never faced the choice between following orders and protecting lives when those alternatives became mutually exclusive. Hawk's 30 GAU A-10 was loaded with arm-piercing incendiary rounds that could devastate personnel and light vehicles with surgical precision, while her external pylons carried precision-guided munitions that could eliminate hardened turrets without causing collateral damage to nearby friendly forces. But her most powerful weapon was patience. The simple willingness to remain on station when remaining on station was the only thing standing between American soldiers and disaster. It ceased to have normal meaning, her mission existing in a space between possible and necessary, where individual determination could temporarily overcome technological limitations and bureaucratic procedures. The sound of her engines had become a promise to ground forces who depended on close air support, a mechanical heartbeat that spoke of American commitment to leaving no soldier behind. Where below, Staff Sergeant Williams was preparing his squad for movement that would likely trigger the ambush she'd been watching develop for hours. The moment of contact was approaching, when her extended vigil would be justified or condemned by her ability to respond with the kind of precision that would determine whether American soldiers survived to return home. Pressed his eye against the scope of his Dragunov rifle, calculating range and wind velocity for a shot that would need to be perfect to penetrate the armored cockpit of the American aircraft that had been circling for 22 hours. His position on the ridgeline provided an optimal angle for engaging the A-10 during its predictable orbit, but the range was at the absolute limit of his weapon's effectivity. Fires had been in position since dawn, their patience tested by an American pilot who seemed determined to remain overhead indefinitely. The extended presence of close air support had forced his unit to abandon their original ambush plan in favor of a more complex operation that would require eliminating the aircraft before engaging ground forces who remained under its protective umbrella. Well, it is either insane or extraordinary, his lieutenant observed in Pashto, using words that carried respect despite their tactical situation. No American has ever maintained station that long. It violates everything we know about their operational procedures. Or not, understanding that they were confronting something outside normal parameters of American military operations. The aircraft above them represented more than close air support. It had become a symbol of individual commitment that transcended institutional limitations, creating a tactical problem that demanded innovative solutions. Radio operator reported American ground movement in the valley, suggesting that the infantry unit was preparing to cross terrain would expose them to the crossfire his fires had spent hours preparing. The tactical situation was reaching a decision point, where action in any direction would likely result in significant casualties on both sides. A-10's flight pattern had become as predictable as sunrise, its pilot maintaining an orbit that provided optimal coverage while remaining outside the effective range of most small arms fire. But Omar had positioned himself at a location where the aircraft's path would bring it within range of precision rifle fire for approximately 3 seconds during each circuit. Calculating that shot for 6 hours, understanding that success would require perfect timing, precise marksmanship, and extraordinary luck. The A-10's cockpit was protected by titanium armor designed to resist anti-aircraft fire, but a well-placed shot might penetrate the canopy or disable flight controls that would force the aircraft to abandon its station. Scope, he could occasionally get glimpses of the pilot during the aircraft's banging turns, a figure that appeared smaller than he expected, but moved with the mechanical precision that spoke of extensive training and combat experience. American military forces include female pilots, a practice that Lowell Fires found both fascinating and tactically irrelevant when those pilots demonstrated capabilities that transcended demographic classification. Was working against his unit in ways that extended beyond immediate tactical considerations. Extended concealment was exhausting his fighters, who'd been maintained position without food or water while waiting for an opportunity to execute their mission. The longer they waited, the more likely they were to be detected by American forces who were undoubtedly using their air coverage to conduct reconnaissance of potential ambush sites. Crossers settled on the point where the aircraft would appear during its next orbit, a calculation that required predicting the exact moment when precision marksmanship might overcome American technology and determination. The shot would either eliminate the tactical problem that had kept his unit pinned in position for nearly a full day, or it would reveal his location and trigger retaliation that would likely destroy his entire operation. The sound of the A-10's engine grew louder as it approached the optimal firing position, its pilot unaware that death was being calculated with mathematical precision from a ridgeline that offered perfect concealment until the moment of engagement. Sergeant Williams saw the muzzle flash from the ridgeline at the exact moment that the A-10's engine note changed from its steady whisper to something that sounded like mechanical distress. The coincidence was too precise to be accidental. Someone had just engaged their air support with what appeared to be precision rifle fire aimed at disabling the aircraft that had been providing overwatch for 22 hours. Tech North Ridgeline, Williams transmitted immediately, his voice carrying the urgency of ground forces who understood that losing air support would fundamentally alter their tactical situation. Hammer 21, report status. Radio remained silent, but the aircraft's flight pattern began to change in ways that suggested the pilot was dealing with emergency procedures well.